Morning everyone. So I want to talk to you today about something that could very likely be silently costing you business. And if you hadn't guessed, it's about website accessibility. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to cover why accessibility matters, some of the most common website accessibility failures, and how you can fix them. But before we get into that, I'll just quickly introduce myself and Squee. So I'm Joe. I've been in the web development industry for well over a decade now. A big part of my career was spent working in in-house software teams, building and designing software for enterprise level clients, starting out in hands-on design and development roles, and eventually moving up into managing larger development and UX teams before packing it all in to start my adventure with Squeak. Now, you might be wondering why there's a random photo of me and a baby on this slide. Um, that's my daughter. She was born in 2023 with a rare form of Down syndrome, and she's been a huge motivation behind why I've started Squee. So I've always cared about website accessibility, but after meeting some amazing people from various charities, local charities who supported us during those early months, I knew I wanted to do something to help make the world a little bit more inclusive in my own way. And that's what pushed me to start Squee, to help businesses build websites that not only look great and convert, but also embed accessibility in from the very start. So, why does accessibility even matter? So, in short, accessibility means making sure your website can be used by everyone, including disabled people. Unfortunately, most websites don't do that. And I'll often hear common myths like, oh, no one's ever complained, so my site must be fine, or oh, accessibility, that means boring design. Neither of those are true, and I'll show you why in just a moment. But first, here's some data that might surprise you. Um, one in four people in the UK and around 1.4 billion globally are disabled, and that includes a wide range of access needs covering visual, auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, and speech disabilities. 96% of the top 1 million websites aren't accessible, and that costs just UK businesses £17.1 billion every year. And that was actually taken from a few years back, so it's very likely that's gone up since. 7 in 10 disabled users will leave a website with accessibility issues, and 86% of disabled users said they paid more for a product or service from an accessible website. So not only does accessibility improve how people experience and perceive your site and business, it actually expands your reach and sales. So the business case for accessibility is pretty difficult to ignore. So next, I just want to walk you through some accessibility issues that anyone can check on their site. There are, of course, more technical aspects of accessibility, which are equally important too. But the four I'm going to show you today are extremely important and some of the biggest problems for users online. And the good news is they're all fixable. So the first check is, what are your colors like? So color contrast, and that means the difference between text and background in brightness, and is actually the number one accessibility issue on the web. Around 81% of websites fail on this, which causes problems for many people, but especially those with low vision or color blindness. And a common example I see all the time is when a company uses their brand color, say they got, I don't know, a light blue from their logo, and they'll use this as a button background and then put white text on top. While it might look okay and kind of fitting with your brand, it's often unreadable for a large group of users. The good news is, while it's common, it's also really easy to check and fix. So if you're using Chrome, for example, you can grab a browser extension or a built-in eyedropper tool to go and grab the exact colors you use on your site. And from there, copy the color values, which are normally hex codes, into a contrast checker. I use Web AIM, which is web accessibility in mind, but there's loads online. Just give them a Google, and it'll give you a score like you can see on the image here. In the top version, the contrast ratio is 1.49, which is a big fat fail for accessibility. And hopefully you can, well, you won't be able to see, but it should be very difficult to read. And in the bottom version, we've increased that contrast ratio to 17.46, which passes with flying colors, and hopefully you should be able to read that. So long story short, if it fails, just choose a color from your contrast checker which has got better contrast and update it in your website builder, or alternatively speak to your developer. Another really good tool, just as an FYI, is there's an extension on Chrome called Wave, and that will give you a big long list of all your contrast failures on your site. So check number two is what I call the tab test. So for people with physical disabilities or conditions like RSI, using a mouse can be difficult or in some cases even impossible. So that's why many people rely on using tab navigation instead. So using the tab key to move between links, buttons, and form fields. So hopefully you can see on the video on the right how this works. There's a little black box in the middle which shows the keystrokes, tab to move through the links, and spacebar to open the submenu. So in the example, you can see this is done really well. There's clear visual indicators around each link, so it's obvious where the user is on the page. Uh, but many websites miss this entirely. Either they've used the wrong HTML, so the element isn't even focusable, or they skipped adding keyboard support to things like drop-down menus altogether, which means some users simply can't access whole parts of your site. So what can you do? Head to your own site and just start pressing tab. Can you reach all the links, buttons, and forms? And just as importantly, can you actually tell where you are? If not, it means your focus states probably need updating, either through your CMS or with your developer's help. And just a side note, if you're planning on buying a theme or hiring someone to build a website or do some work on it, I always recommend doing the tab test first on their site, and it'll just give you a clue as to whether accessibility has been factored in. So check number three, do your images have alt tags? So first, what is an alt tag, which is a fair question. It's alternative text that describes an image for people who can't see it, like blind or visually impaired users. It's also really helpful because it shows up when images fail to load, acts as a backup to help users understand what should be there. So, for example, if you've got a low connection on your phone and images taking a long time to load, that'll show up in its place. Most website builders, CMS platforms, and social media tools, give you the option to add alt text, but it's often ignored, or worse, it's added in a way that's not helpful at all. So if you take the example on the right, you'll see a good alt tag and a not so great one. And to be honest, actually, people at a table is better than most. I've seen a lot worse. I was auditing actually a company last week, and for every single image on their website, they just have the company name as the alt tag, which isn't particularly helpful. Or another really common example is people just copy and paste the file name in. So someone on a screen reader would likely hear for the image that's up there, something like people.png, and that's if they're lucky. So what you really want to do is write something that's descriptive but concise. So almost think of it as like writing a tweet. So you want to get across the meaning and purpose of the image clearly and quickly. So what can you do? Obviously go through your site and check your images. If they don't have alt tags, add them in and make sure that alt tag is clear, descriptive, and explains the image's purpose. And just a little side note, avoid phrases like images, image of, or picture of, because screen readers already tell users that is an image. And the final check is, what are your forms like? So forms are absolutely pivotal to businesses, especially during that checkout and inquiry phase. But it's mind-blowing how often people get this wrong and end up costing their businesses money. So it's absolutely vital that forms have labels and that those labels are linked correctly to the corresponding input. This is because without it, a screen reader will have no context of what the input actually is, making it impossible to fill out. So in the example on the right, you can see a really bad example. In the bottom input, there is just a placeholder text, which is text inside of an input, which disappears once you start typing. This should never, ever be used as a replacement for labels. Placeholders should only be used to guide the user into what content should be in the input, like in the good example above, where it shows the format the date should be in. In the good example, you also see the input has a proper label that's clearly linked, so screen readers, users can actually get the right context. But it also has the correct semantic input type, in this case, a date picker, which means on things like mobile devices, it'll automatically bring up the right keyboard or calendar input. So if you're on your iPhone, you'll get the little scrolly options to select your year, month, and date. So make sure you use the right labels, and you can check that they're linked and coded correctly by clicking on the label itself. And if it is coded correctly, it should highlight the input below and make it focusable. And if it doesn't, obviously contact your developer or make sure your IDs and for labels match in your website builder where you store your form. And
You have 1 minute,
finally,
Jeff.
nearly finished. And finally, just a quick note, and obviously we've got a lawyer on this call, so he might know more about this than me, but I don't usually like to talk about legislation too much because I think the focus of accessibility should be more on the business benefits and outweigh any real legal responsibility. But that said, if you have consumers in the EU, I think it's quite important to know about the European Accessibility Act that comes into effect on the 28th of June 2025. And it's a real big step in making sure digital products and services are more accessible. The details are extensive, that's why I don't want to get into it. And each EU member state will have its own version of the rules. But I think the key takeaway is this really. If you have a website that serves EU customers, you want to make sure that it's WCAG 2.1 compliant to avoid potential penalties or issues down the line. And WCAG 2.1, that's the Web Content Accessibility Guideline, and it's a list of guidelines to make sure your website is accessible. Now, I know that probably won't affect too many people here today, but I think it's just worth keeping on your radar and being aware of. And just to finish, there are of course more technical checks you can run to see how accessible your website really is. So if you're curious about that, I offer a free accessibility scorecard. It's a quick, no pressure way to get some practical feedback. So either drop me a message or head over to squeeze.design/scorecard to request one. And hopefully you can now see the importance of website accessibility, not just from an ethical perspective, but from a business case want to. Thank you for listening.